So this week we cover our last sections of Chapter 16. We have Section 1 and Section 3, and then we get into the bonds in Chapter 19, Section 3. Chapter 16, Section 1 deals with credit cards and how do they calculate that weighted average balance to fairly charge you finance charges on those credit cards. So, I mean, credit cards are everywhere in our economy, and they're not going anywhere anytime soon. They can be a very useful tool. So we need to understand how, if we carry a balance on those credit cards, how they can charge us interest. So what we go through is we go through calculating our weighted average daily balance, because say you start with $100 today and then you charge, $900 on the last day of the month. Is it fair for them to charge you interest on $1,000? No, because you started with $100 and you ended with a purchase of $900. So how we set that up is we look at what their previous balance is, and then we kind of map out our days. So I set it up in columns, and I would say date, our transaction, our balance, and then that we multiply by our days outstanding. So then if we go to a problem, it's a very, very basic one. If we have a credit card statement that has a previous balance of $139.56, so that's my balance, and that is on our billing date, which is September 12th. So nothing happened. This is just, that was my starting balance. Then on September 20th, I then make a payment. So if I make a payment, I'm going to reduce my balance. But then what I want to do here is stop for a minute and say, okay, my billing date was September 12th, and I had this balance. My next transaction didn't happen until September 20th, so that was 8 days. So then that 8 relates to these two dates. The difference between these two dates goes up to that top line, and it says, okay, I had $139.56 outstanding for 8 days. Then on the 20th, I reduced my balance. It went from $139.56, and I paid $45. So that gives me a balance now of $94.56. And then how many days did I have that balance? Well, then I have to look to when my next transaction is. Tells me on September 21st, I make a purchase and I charge $37.25. So then that was only 1 day. So only 1 day do I have that balance of $94.56. Then the next day I make a purchase, so then I have to increase that by the $37.25. I add that to the $94.56 to get $131.81. And then how many days did I have that? So then again, this is the end of the transactions. It's a very basic one. You could obviously keep going with multiple purchases, but the principles are still the same. But the problem tells me that the billing date is the same day each month. So if I was billed on the 12th of September, I'm going to be billed on the 12th of October. So then this would be one. I mean, you could use your date function if you don't know how many days are in September. That date function on our calculator like we did in the last chapter. I know that there's 30 days in September, so there would be 9 days to get to the end of September, plus 12 days into October. So that's going to be 21 days. Now then I always, before I do the math of actually multiplying these out, I always make sure I've accounted for all of the days that are in the month of my billing cycle. So here I would have 30 days, and then I know there's 30 days in September. So then that's kind of my double check. So then I'm good with that. Now I'll go ahead and do the math to multiply those out. So 139.56 times 8 gives us $1,116.48. $94.56 times 1. And then $138.81 times 21 days gives us $2,768.01. Then I can add those up. and that gives me $3,979.05. That number is only used to calculate out our weighted average daily balance, though. So if I take that number and I divide it by my 30 days that are in that billing period, then I get my average. So 132.64. And then always double check that to look at it to say, okay, my balance started at 139, dropped down to 94, and then went back up to 131. That, like just eyeballing it, looks like the correct average. That looks like a fair amount to charge me. And then that is what they use it for. Then it tells us in the problem that they charge 1.5% per month. So if I multiply that times 1.5, sorry, that would give me $1.99 in finance charges. So then that's a lot of times what it asks for. What is your average balance? What is your finance charge? And then the last thing that it could ask is your amount due. So your amount due is going to be where your balance ended plus your finance charge. So after all of my transactions, my account ended at $131.81, but then based on the balances that I carried, the bank charged me $1.99. So $133.80 is my amount due. All right, can we see that? There we go. All right, so then that is our total problem. So you may have all three of those things: the average balance, the finance charge, and then the amount due. Okay. So you'll have a problem like that, probably maybe more transactions, but you set it up the same way and you compute for those same three items. Okay, so that's section 1. Then section 3, we kind of revert back to our maturity value formulas. Section 3 is dealing with if you do have a note with a business or a bank and you choose to make a partial payment at some point in time during that note, it can save you interest because they can only charge you interest on the amount outstanding for the amount of time outstanding. So if you all of a sudden have a lump sum you want to place on that loan, it's going to reduce the balance and then reduce the interest that you pay. So we've got like a partial payment one. So say we have a loan of $6,000 at 10.5%, or I should say a note of $6,000 at 10.5% for 130 days. If on day 100 a partial payment of $3,000 is made, find the total amount of interest paid and then the amount due on the note at its ending date, at the 130 days. So those are two-step problems. So again, we're going back to our maturity value equals our principal plus our interest. And then don't forget that our interest is our principal times our rate times our time. So I'm actually going to leave it in like that. Because these ones are kind of long and two-step, I'll just leave it in that big formula and kind of solve for what I can. So initially we've got the $6,000 that we have borrowed, so that's our principal, and then that's what they get to charge us interest on. Our rate is 10.5%, and then our total time for the note is 130 days. But again, because they're making a payment, they're making a partial payment of half the amount, actually $3,000 on day 100, that's what we use. So that's our days to the partial payment, because they're not legally allowed to charge you for interest that you haven't actually, I don't want to say earned because you're paying it, but they can only go up to that day that you make that partial payment. Now then that you do legitimately owe them the interest on. So if I take everything here in the parentheses and multiply that, the 6,000 times the 10.5% times the 100 days divided by 360, I get interest of $175. So now I'm going to go back, add that to my my principal. So on the day that they make that partial payment, they would actually owe $6,175. The principal plus the interest accrued up to that point. So then on that day, they make a partial payment. So maybe all of a sudden they came into some money, they're able to pay $3,000 down. So then that now becomes their new balance, $3,175. They still have, the original note was for 130 days, so they still have 30 days left. So then we go back to our formula, but then now this new balance becomes our new principal. So we've got $3,175. That's the amount they're going to be able to charge us interest on. It's still at the same rate. And then now our time, though, is just 30 days. So that's our days remaining. And that's probably where students make the most mistakes, is in these days. So make sure you're always putting it over a full year. Our time is always in terms of a year, so that'd be over the 360. And then you break the days out. So the first computation is from the date the note was issued until they made that partial payment. And then the second part's going to be from the partial payment date until the note is actually due. So in this case, that's the remaining 30 days. Now, let's see if I can squishy this so I can keep going. Am I going the wrong way? Okay, so let's kind of keep going to our next step. I'm going to cut off some of that top computation. Okay, then we keep going with our calculation. So if I multiply everything here in this parentheses, I get the remainder of interest that they can charge me. So $3,175 times 10.5% times 30 divided by 360 gives me interest of $27.78. I can add that back to my principal of $3,175. So at the end of that loan, I'm going to owe $3,202.78. So that's one of the things that they asked for. Then the other thing says, well, how much total interest? This here is interest, and then this here is interest. So again, if I add those together, I will get the second thing that it's asking for. So the $175 plus the $27.78, that gives us total interest of $202.78. So those are the two things that it asks for. And it is, it's one of your, it's probably one of your harder questions because you got to think it through and you got to map those days out. And it's just a way to protect consumers, because if you are able to put a principal payment like that down, the bank should no longer be able to charge you, at this higher rate, because now your balance is reduced. So it still goes back to the rate they're willing to charge you for however many days is left. Okay, so that is our two sections in Chapter 16. Then if we jump to Chapter 19, we cover Section 3 on bonds, because bonds are a very relevant financial topic. If you're an accounting major, you are going to see bonds in at least probably 3 more classes. So it's good to kind of get an understanding of what they are. As a business management major, it depends if you have to take business finance, you'll see them again there. You may not see them though in another class. Well, no, you probably will see them in financial accounting, so you may see them in a couple other classes. So it's good to understand them because they're a topic that are hard for students to grasp. So for our bonds, basically what those are they are just loans in $1,000 increments from investors to businesses. And they pay interest annually or semi-annually, depending. I may need to move move this back a bit so I get that back on there. Sorry about that. Okay. So then because you do want to get your mind around what they do. So basically, kind of map it out for you. As an investor, say you've got a 401k and you want to put some money into a bond fund. So if you're doing that, you're saying, okay, if I have $1,000, I could buy one bond of, let's say, IBM bonds. So I'm basically loaning them $1,000, and then they'll pay me interest, either once a year or twice a year. So I'm happy with that. And then at the end of the bond life, if it's, let's say, 10 years, they give me my $1,000 back. So it's not like stock where you buy it and you're an owner and there's no ending date. A bond it's like an IOU between you and that business. You loan them $1,000, they pay you back $1,000 when it comes due, plus they pay you interest. The thing is, since these bonds go for like 10 years, at the time that, say, IBM issues those bonds, they're going to issue them at whatever the interest rate is at that time. So say it's 5%. Well, then 2 years later, interest rates change. Maybe they go up, maybe they go down. More recently, they've been going down. So say 2 years later, the interest rates have gone down to 3%. Well, then everybody's going to want those 5% bonds because they're paying more. If it went the other way, say interest rates went up, and these IBM bonds are paying 5%, and then all of a sudden all these other businesses are issuing bonds at 7%, well, then no one's going to want those IBM bonds because they could invest somewhere else and make 7%. So then what happens is the price that you pay for those bonds today goes up or down, depending on the interest rates. You always get $1,000 back at the end. That part is like a legal contract between you and the company, but what you pay today will change depending on what the interest rates have done. So I think that's what makes it kind of complex. Now what we do though is we go back to our financial calculators. So this will be the only thing in your current material that you go back to the financial calculators for. You will have them in your comprehensive material, but not in your current, other than this bond question. And then this is the thing to know though, with a bond, you are always computing for the present value, so then you don't ever have to wonder. And the other nice thing is you're using all 5 keys, so none of them are zeroed out. So we're going to use all 5 keys and always compute for the present value, because the question is, how much would I buy those bonds for today? So say if we have an example of a corporate bond that has $1,000 face value and matures in 22 years, and it pays 7.25% in interest annually. Find the present value if the current market rate of interest is 6%. So the face value of the bond is our future value. So I mean, maybe use that as a FV could stand for face value, so that could be a clue to you. But it's $1,000. They're going to pay us $1,000 back when those bonds come due. They pay 7.25%. So if we take our $1,000 that we're loaning them and we multiply that by 7.25%, we can see that the bonds will pay us $72.50 per year. So that's money coming to us. So we're going to get $72.50 each year, plus we're going to get our $1,000 back at the end. Now, how long are the bonds? They mature in 22 years, so that's our N. And then the IY is what the current market rate is. So then that's probably the tricky one, because then what students struggle with on this is, well, which IY, which rate do I put where? Their stated rate, what they're going to pay you, goes into your payment. What the market rate is your IY. So this is the one that changes. What they pay you is always the same. So for these entire 22 years, this corporation is going to pay 7.25% on those bonds. What changes is market. So then market in my example here is 6%. So then if we think about this, before we put it into our calculator, if all other companies are now issuing out bonds and they're paying 6%, and this company's bonds are outstanding and they're paying 7.25%, well, if I'm an investor, I want to make the higher percentage. I want to make 7.25%. So I'm going to want to buy these bonds, but so is everybody else. So now all of a sudden, everybody wants to buy these bonds. What do we think the price is going to do? We think it's going to go up. So when we put it in the calculator, we'll see how far up it will go. So 22 is our N, 6 is our IY, 72.5 is the payment. Make sure these are both the same direction. I'm going to leave them both positive because it's money coming in. $1,000 is our future value. Then come back and compute the present value. So it's $1,150.52. So it held true to what we were thinking. We thought it would sell for more than $1,000 because it's paying more. So then that is what you want to be able to do. Now I will warn you, you could also have them semi-annually. So like I say up here, if they are semi-annually, then you have to go back to our time value of money rules where we say we're going to take our N and multiply it by 2. We're going to take our IY and divide it by 2. And then we're going to take our payment and divide it by 2. Because right now this is an annual payment. So that's annual, annual, and annual. So all 3 of those would have to be divided by 2 if you had a semi-annual one. Okay. So that is your bonds. So again, maybe watch this a couple times to get comfortable with that, because sometimes students struggle a little bit with bonds. Even when they get into business finance and later courses, they're still kind of a struggle. All right.